"It hurts so much I can't bear it," the Apache girl said, the lone rancher. In the wide open expanse of the western frontier, where the sun beat down relentlessly and the wind carried dust across endless plains, Ethan lived a solitary life. His ranch, tucked away in the heart of the rugged landscape, was both his refuge and his prison. The loneliness had settled in him like a heavy weight, one he could never quite shake off. It was the kind of loneliness that stretched out for miles, as vast as the land itself. He often thought about his past, about the family he had lost. His wife and young daughter had died in a sudden illness a few years ago, and since then he had been alone. The silence of the ranch seemed to echo their absence. Every day was the same for Ethan. He woke before dawn, worked from sunrise to sunset, and then retired to his modest cabin to sleep, only to wake and do it all over again. There was no one to talk to, no one to share his thoughts or his troubles with. The land was his only companion, the endless stretches of grass and rolling hills that could never speak back but were always there. The animals, his horses, cattle, and the occasional stray dog, provided him with work, but they didn't fill the hole inside him. He had been trying to keep busy, working hard to forget, but every day the memories lingered like shadows in the corners of his mind. Ethan was a man of few words, Brait. He had learned over time that silence could sometimes be more comforting than conversation, but that didn't mean the silence didn't weigh on him. Break. There was no one left to share his life with, no one to help him take care of the ranch or share in the small joys of the day-to-day. The house felt cold, even when the fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled outside. Ethan had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that he could get by on his own. After all, what good was companionship if it only led to loss? On this particular day, Ethan rode out to check the farthest corners of his property, the part of the ranch that was wild and untamed. He had been meaning to get out there for days, but it always seemed like there was something else to do, something more pressing. The sun was high in the sky, and the heat was unbearable as he made his way across the dry land on his horse Dusty. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard earth, and Ethan's thoughts wandered, as they often did, to the past. He thought of the sound of his daughter's laughter, of the way his wife's eyes would light up when she smiled. The memories were bittersweet, painful yet precious. As Ethan approached a ridge overlooking a small creek, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow in the distance. But as he drew closer, he realized it was a young woman, standing at the edge of his property. She wasn't dressed like the local townsfolk. She wore a worn, weather-beaten dress and a shawl that looked like it had seen better days. Her long, dark hair was pulled back, and her face was hard to read. Breath.
She stood perfectly still, staring out at the land, her back to him. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of her.
She was a stranger, someone he hadn't seen before, and she didn't look like she belonged. She seemed out of place in the vast emptiness of the land. Ethan approached cautiously, unsure of whether she needed help or was simply passing through. As he neared, the woman finally turned, her eyes meeting his. There was a sadness in her eyes, a quiet sorrow that spoke to him more than words ever could. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice rough from the lack of use. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe longer. The woman didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm.
"I'm lost," she said. "I don't know where I am."
Ethan's brow furrowed. He had never seen her before, and yet there was something about her that felt familiar, something in the way she carried herself that reminded him of a time long ago. He knew the land well, but he had never come across anyone like her out here. "Where are you from?" he asked, dismounting from his horse and tying it to a nearby post. He approached her slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. She looked like she could easily be startled, like someone who had been through something she didn't want to talk about. She hesitated before answering. "I'm from the Apache tribe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I left. I had to leave." There was something raw and vulnerable in her voice, and it made him pause. He had heard stories of raids and conflict between settlers and Native American tribes, but he had never thought much about it. It was a distant thing, something that happened far away from his quiet life on the ranch. But looking at her now, he could see that she wasn't just a victim of the land. She was a person with her own story, her own heartache. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his tone gentle. He wasn't sure why he asked. It wasn't like him to pry into someone's life. But there was something about this woman that made him want to know more, made him want to understand the pain in her eyes. She swallowed hard, her throat working as if she was struggling to find the right words. "My family," she started, then stopped, her eyes clouding over. "They were taken. I couldn't stay. I had to run." Ethan's heart tightened at her words. He didn't ask for more details. He didn't need to. He could see the weight of her grief, the depth of her loss. It was the same pain he had felt when he had lost his own family. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. He couldn't leave her out here alone. The land was unforgiving, especially to those who didn't know how to survive it. Might be a stranger to her, but he couldn't ignore the way her pain mirrored his own. "You don't have to be alone," Ethan said, surprising himself with the offer. He had never been one to invite strangers into his home, but something about her made him feel like she needed help, like she needed a place to rest, even if only for a little while. The woman looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Ethan didn't know what had come over him, but he didn't question it. Turned back toward his horse, guiding her to where the small cabin was located. It wasn't much, a modest place with a worn roof and a hearth that could barely keep the chill out. But it was home, and for now, it was all he could offer her. As they walked in silence, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what had led her to this point, what had driven her to leave everything behind. He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her, but he felt an unspoken connection to her, one that was born out of shared pain and the understanding that sometimes the world could be a cruel, unforgiving place. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with the recognition that words weren't always necessary. Sometimes just being there for someone was enough. As the sun began to dip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan led the woman to the cabin. His horse, Dusty, trotted steadily along the familiar path, the soft clop of the hooves, the only sound in the evening air. The landscape, which Ethan had seen 1,000 times before, seemed different now. Almost surreal, as if everything had shifted, if only for a moment. The woman, still silent beside him, kept her gaze lowered. Her steps were careful, measured, as though she was still unsure of where she was, or perhaps unsure of him. Ethan respected her silence, inspiration. He had learned over the years that not everyone was ready to talk, especially not to a stranger. He knew that better than anyone. When they reached the cabin, Ethan led the woman inside. The air inside was warm, the faint smell of wood and earth filling the small space. It wasn't much, but it was home. The flickering light from the small fireplace in the corner gave the cabin a cozy, lived-in feel. It was a stark contrast to the cold, empty nights he'd spent alone. "Take a seat," Ethan said, gesturing to the simple wooden table in the center of the room. He moved toward the fireplace and began stoking the flames, careful not to make a mess of the few logs left. The fire crackled, and for a moment the room was filled with the sound of burning wood. The woman hesitated before sitting down at the table, her movements cautious, like she was afraid of being caught in some kind of trap. Ethan didn't blame her. Breath. She was a stranger in a strange land, and he was offering her something she had no reason to trust. But it was the least he could do. As he moved around the cabin gathering a few things to make a meal, Ethan could feel her eyes on him. He wasn't used to having anyone in his space, let alone someone who had clearly been through so much. But he knew that he couldn't just send her off into the night, not with the way she had looked at him when she spoke of her family, of her loss. After a few moments of silence, the woman spoke, her voice barely audible. You don't have to do this. I can leave. Ethan paused, looking at her from across the room. He wasn't sure if she was trying to push him away or if she genuinely believed that she didn't deserve his kindness. You're not leaving tonight, he said firmly. It's too dangerous out there. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need.
Her eyes flickered toward the fire, and for a long time, neither of them spoke.
The crackling of the logs was the only sound filling the space between them. Ethan kept working, pulling a pot from the shelf and setting it on the stove. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage a simple meal, and right now, that seemed like the best way to offer some comfort. I'm Ethan, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. And you are? The woman looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Ayana, she said softly. Ayana of the Apache tribe. Ethan nodded, repeating the name to himself. Ayana, he said, testing the sound of it. It was beautiful, simple, and it seemed to fit her in some strange way. He could tell she didn't want to talk much about her past, but that was fine for now. He wasn't going to push her. They ate in silence, the food simple but filling, the warmth of the fire making the small cabin feel like a sanctuary from the cold night outside. Ayana didn't seem to eat much, picking up the food on her plate, but Ethan didn't press her. It was clear she wasn't ready to open up. As the night wore on, Ethan made a bed for her by the fire, pulling a thick blanket from his own bed to spread out on the floor. The room wasn't big, but there was enough space for them both, and for once the silence felt comfortable, even if it was heavy with unspoken words. Ayana lay down on the blanket, staring up at the ceiling, her thoughts far away. Ethan sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth desk. He had no idea how long she had been on her own or how much pain she had carried with her, but he knew that the world had a way of pushing people to their limits, and sometimes all it took was a little kindness to remind someone that they weren't alone. As the fire began to die down, Ethan couldn't help but feel a connection to Ayana, even though they had just met. He had lived alone for so long in a world where people were too busy with their own struggles to notice each other. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he was reminded that sometimes people found each other at the right moment, even in the most unlikely of places. Boo. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and moved to the window. The sky outside was clear, the stars twinkling brightly in the night. The land seemed peaceful, quiet, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Ethan turned back to Ayana, still lying on the floor. You should get some sleep, he said quietly. Tomorrow's another day. Ayana didn't respond right away, but after a few moments, she nodded. Breaths. She seemed to relax a little, her body sinking into the blanket as she closed her eyes. Ethan knew that sleep wouldn't come easy for her, not with everything she had been through. But for now, the warmth of the cabin and the safety of being inside might offer her some small comfort. Ethan made his way to his own bed, which was simple and plain, but it was all he had. As he lay down, his mind wandered to the past, to the things he had lost, and to the woman who now shared his space. He had no idea what the future would hold, or how long she would stay, but in this moment they were both survivors, two souls connected by the harsh realities of the world they lived in. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan's thoughts lingered on Ayanna. He wondered if she would ever find peace. He wondered if he would ever find peace. But for tonight, the silence between them was enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was shared, and that in itself felt like a small victory. The next morning, Ethan woke early, as was his habit. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow across the land outside the window. The peaceful stillness of the morning felt different today, more promising somehow. Maybe it was because Ayanna was still here, or maybe it was simply the quiet hope that things could be different even for a brief moment. He stretched his stiff limbs and walked over to the stove to start the coffee, the rich aroma filling the small cabin.
It was a ritual he had come to rely on, a comfort in a world that had felt out of his control for far too long.
As the coffee brewed, Ethan glanced over at the makeshift bed by the fire where Ayanna had spent the night. She was still asleep, her chest rising and falling gently with each breath. She looked peaceful in her sleep, a small hint of vulnerability on her face that reminded Ethan of her struggles. He didn't know much about her, only that she had lost her family, and that was enough for him to understand her pain. He had his own losses to carry, the ghosts of his past still lingering in the corners of his mind. The sudden death of his wife and child had left a scar on his heart that hadn't healed. No matter how much time had passed, the emptiness of his ranch felt heavier with every day, but Ayanna's presence somehow made it seem a little less lonely. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling sound. He turned around to find Ayanna sitting up, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She rubbed her eyes, taking in her surroundings for a moment before she looked up at him. "Good morning," Ethan said, offering her a quiet smile. Ayanna didn't respond immediately. She seemed to be taking in the cabin and everything around her, as if trying to process where she was. It was clear she hadn't been in a safe place for a long time. He knew it wouldn't be easy for her to adjust, but he also knew that sometimes time and patience were the only things that could heal a broken spirit. Ayanna slowly stood up and stretched, her movements stiff and cautious. "I didn't mean to sleep so long," she said, her voice still rough from sleep. "I don't know what happened." "I've been running for so long, I forgot what it felt like to rest." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He simply nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain that would drive someone to run, to leave everything behind just to survive. But he knew what it was like to feel trapped in your own sorrow, to feel like there was no way out. "You're safe here," Ethan said softly, his voice steady. "Take your time. There's no rush." Ayanna looked at him for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. She nodded slowly, but still didn't speak. Ethan wasn't bothered by the silence. He understood that words couldn't always fix things, and sometimes simply being there for someone was enough. After a few moments, Ayanna walked over to the small table where the coffee was waiting. She hesitated before sitting down, her fingers brushing against the mug as if she were unsure of what to do next. Ethan poured her a cup, his hand steady as he passed it to her. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the mug from him. She sipped it slowly, the warmth of the drink seemingly comforting her. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan, it felt like a step in the right direction. They sat in silence for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The warmth from the fire mixed with the quiet of the morning, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere. But Ethan could feel the weight of the unsaid words between them, the things they both carried but hadn't yet shared. Bravest. Finally, Ayanna broke the silence. "I never wanted to leave," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I never wanted to lose everything. But sometimes, Brian, sometimes there's no choice." Ethan turned to her, his expression softening. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. The pain in her eyes said more than words ever could. He understood what she meant. There were times in life when choices were taken from you, when survival was all that mattered. "I know," he said, his voice low. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like there's nothing left." Ayanna looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "How do you keep going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How do you keep going when everything feels like it's falling apart?" Ethan paused, considering her question. He wasn't sure he had an answer. The truth was, he didn't always know how he kept going. Some days felt easier than others, but there were nights when the pain felt just as raw as the day he lost his family. The memories of his wife and daughter haunted him, and some days the weight of his grief seemed unbearable. But he didn't want to burden Ayanna with his own struggles. She had enough to carry. Instead, he offered her a simple truth. "You take it one day at a time," he said, his voice steady. "You find something to hold on to. Maybe it's a memory, or a person, or just the will to survive. And you keep moving forward even when it feels impossible." Ayanna looked down at her hands, nodding slowly. She didn't speak for a while, but Ethan could tell she was thinking about what he said. Maybe it was starting to make sense to her. Or maybe it was just the first time someone had told her that she wasn't alone in her pain.
The rest of the morning passed quietly.
Brash. Ethan went outside to check on the ranch, while Ayan remained inside, sitting by the fire. He didn't expect her to follow him. Not yet. She needed time, and he wasn't going to rush her. The ranch wasn't a large place, but it kept him busy. There was always work to do, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and keeping the land in good condition. It was simple work, but it had kept him sane over the years. Breath. As he worked, he found his thoughts drifting back to Ayanna. She had been through so much already, and yet she had made it this far. She was stronger than she realized. But strength wasn't just about survival. It was about learning to live again, to find hope after everything had been taken from you. When Ethan returned to the cabin later that day, Ayanna was still sitting by the fire, her face thoughtful, but she didn't look as lost as she had when she first arrived. There was a quiet determination in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Ethan could see that she was beginning to process her grief, even if only in small ways. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ayanna said when he walked in, "about taking it one day at a time. I think I can do that. But I think maybe I can start over." Ethan smiled, a small but genuine smile. "That's all anyone can do," he said. "Start over." And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like maybe he had started over too. Maybe it wasn't just Ayanna who was healing. Maybe, just maybe, he was, too. As the days passed, the routine of ranch life began to settle into a comforting rhythm for both Ethan and Ayanna. The mornings were the same. Ethan would wake early, start the fire, and prepare a simple breakfast. Ayanna, still adjusting to the steady pace of ranch life, would wake shortly after, and the two would sit together over their meal, the quiet of the morning enveloping them.
Though neither spoke much, the silence between them no longer felt awkward. It was as though they had both learned to live with it, accepting it as a part of their lives.
Ethan found himself looking forward to those quiet moments more than he had anticipated. There was something about having someone else in the house, even if they didn't talk all the time, that made the days seem less lonely. He had spent so many years in solitude that the small things, like the sound of another person moving around the cabin or the soft murmur of conversation, felt like a blessing. Ayana, on the other hand, was starting to adapt to the life that Ethan had built. She had come from a place of loss and fear, but in the days since she had arrived, something inside her had started to change. She still carried the weight of her past, but she was beginning to find moments of peace. Slowly, she began to take on small tasks around the ranch, feeding the animals, mending fences, and even helping Ethan with the planting in the garden. It was simple work, but it gave her a sense of purpose, something she hadn't had in a long time. One morning, as Ethan was preparing to leave the cabin to check on the cattle, Ayana surprised him by standing by the door, ready to go with him. "You don't have to come," Ethan said, raising an eyebrow.
"I can handle it." Ayana shook her head, her expression determined. "I want to help," she said.
"I've been sitting here long enough. I need to do something." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There was no reason to turn her down. If she wanted to help, he would let her. They had been through so much in such a short time, and the last thing Ethan wanted was to hold her back from healing in her own way. The two of them made their way out to the pasture, the air cool and crisp in the early morning. Ethan led the way on horseback, while Ayana followed on foot. It wasn't long before they reached the herd of cattle grazing lazily in the distance. The sound of hooves crunching against the dry earth and the low hum of the wind through the grass were the only things that filled the space between them.
"Here," Ethan said, stopping his horse and gesturing to a nearby fence that needed repair.
"The fence has been giving me trouble for a few days. We'll fix it together." Ayana nodded and moved to gather the tools, her movements sure and steady. As she worked alongside Ethan, she found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. The simple tasks of the ranch, though physically demanding, gave her a sense of accomplishment. Every nail she hammered, every post she set into the ground, made her feel a little more grounded. It was the first time in years that she had done something that didn't feel like survival. For the first time, she wasn't just trying to get by. She was creating something, working towards something. As the day wore on, they finished the repairs on the fence and moved on to the next task. Ethan had always enjoyed the work, though it was never easy. It gave him something to focus on, a way to clear his mind. But having Ayana by his side made the work feel lighter somehow. He didn't have to say much, just the occasional instruction or a simple exchange about the weather. But her presence, her willingness to learn, made everything feel different. After a few hours, they decided to take a break. The sun was high in the sky now, and the heat of the day was beginning to settle in. Ethan led his horse to a small patch of shade under a tree, and Ayana sat down on a nearby rock, wiping sweat from her brow. They shared a simple meal, bread and cheese, and drank from the canteen. "Do you ever miss it?" Ayana asked suddenly, her voice soft. She wasn't looking at him, but at the horizon, where the land stretched out endlessly. Ethan wasn't sure what she meant at first. "Miss what?" "Your old life," she said, glancing at him now. Before all of this. Before the ranch. Before the loss. Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. It was something he had thought about many times. He had loved his family dearly, and losing them had torn a part of him that he didn't think could ever be mended. But when he thought of the life he had now, the quiet peace of the ranch, the work that kept him busy, and now Ayana's presence, he realized that maybe he didn't miss his old life as much as he thought he did.
I think I missed the idea of it, Ethan said slowly.
But I miss what could have been. But this life, the one I have now, it's different.
I don't know if it's better, but it's mine.
Ayana looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful.
I think that's the hardest part, she said. The loss isn't just the people or the things you had.
It's the life you thought you'd have. The future that was taken away. Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It wasn't just about losing loved ones. It was about losing the chance to grow old with them, to share the simple joys of life, like watching the seasons change or sitting by the fire with a loved one at the end of a long day. Those were the things that he missed the most. They sat in silence for a while, letting the moment stretch out between them. The quiet was comfortable now, the kind that comes from shared understanding. Neither of them needed to speak constantly to fill the space. They had both been through too much to expect anything else. As the day drew to a close, they made their way back to the cabin. The tasks were simple, but they had both worked hard, and it felt good to know they had accomplished something together. As they walked back, Ethan couldn't help but notice how different things felt now. Ayana had become a part of his world, a part of the rhythm of life on the ranch. Bo! She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone he could rely on, someone who understood the silence, the grief, and the slow, steady process of healing. When they returned to the cabin, the warmth of the fire greeted them, and they shared another quiet meal together. The days ahead were uncertain. Neither of them knew what the future would bring. But in that moment, sitting by the fire, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. And for Ayana, that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Best back. Life on the ranch, once lonely and quiet for Ethan, had become full of purpose, and even a sense of peace. Ayana had become an integral part of his daily life, and with each passing day their connection deepened in ways neither had expected. The work was still hard and the land remained as vast and unforgiving as ever, but there was a new rhythm to it all. They worked side by side, not just out of necessity, but because it was what they had learned to do together. Ayana had found herself growing stronger with each task. She had always been resilient, but now she was building a future instead of running from the past. The land, once a source of fear and pain for her, had become a place of healing. Every morning as the sun began to rise and the light stretched across the sky, Ayana would look out at the horizon, no longer feeling lost in it. She had found a place for herself here, a small but solid corner in a world that had once seemed so cruel. One morning as they worked in the garden, Ayana spoke up again. It had become something of a habit, sharing thoughts as they worked. This time her voice was steady, her words thoughtful.
Ethan, she began, her hands steady as she worked the soil. I've been thinking a lot about the past, about the things I lost.
But I think I'm finally starting to understand something. Ethan paused for a moment, looking up at her. But the words she had spoken were familiar to him. He had thought about his own losses so many times that it felt like they were etched into his soul. But there was something different about the way she said it now, as if she had come to a new understanding, one that might bring her the peace she had been searching for. What is it? Ethan asked, his voice gentle. Ayana took a deep breath, pausing in her work for a moment. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both pain and resolve.
I think I've spent so much time holding on to the past, trying to change it, that I forgot to live in the present.
I forgot to let myself heal, and I've realized that if I keep holding on to what's gone, I might miss what's right in front of me. Ethan's heart tightened as he listened to her words. He knew exactly what she meant. There had been a time when he, too, had been consumed by the past, unable to move forward, trapped in the memories of what he had lost. But now, as he looked at Ayanna, he saw someone who had finally begun to let go. She was still scarred, still carrying her past with her, but she wasn't letting it control her anymore. She was moving forward.
That's a hard thing to do, Ethan said softly. Letting go.
But I think you're right. The past is never going to change. But what we do with the present, that's up to us. Ayanna nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. I think I'm starting to understand that. I'm starting to see that maybe I don't have to carry all of this weight. Maybe I can let go of some of it. They continued working in silence for a while, the weight of her words lingering between them. It wasn't just about the ranch, or the chores, or even the healing they both needed. It was about something deeper, something that was taking root between them, hope. Over the following weeks, Ayanna's presence on the ranch continued to grow. She took on more responsibilities, learning the ins and outs of the land, from tending the animals to fixing fences. There were moments when she would pause and look out at the vast land, her eyes searching for something, perhaps for a future that seemed uncertain. But Ethan could see the shift in her. She was no longer the frightened girl who had shown up on his doorstep months ago. She was someone who had learned to face her fears, who was slowly rebuilding her life, piece by piece. Ethan, too, found himself changing. He hadn't realized just how much he had closed himself off until Ayanna came into his life. He had been living with the memory of his wife and daughter, holding on to the past as though it was the only thing that defined him. But now he saw that there was more to life than the pain of loss. There was the beauty of what he had in front of him. The work, the land, and, most importantly, Ayanna. Together, they had started something new, something neither of them had expected. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the land, Ayanna and Ethan sat by the fire outside, the warm glow lighting their faces. The air was cool, but the fire offered comfort against the chill of the evening. Ayanna had taken to sitting with him after a long day's work, talking quietly about everything and nothing at all. It was the first time in a long while that either of them felt like they had time to just be. Ayanna looked over at Ethan, her expression soft. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Ethan looked at her, considering the question. "I used to think a lot about the future," he said. "About what might happen. About what I had lost. But now, I think about today. About what we're doing right now. I think about what we've built together."
Ayanna smiled, the warmth of the fire reflecting in her eyes.
"I never thought I'd find something like this," she said quietly. "I never thought I could start over, that I could find a place where I belong. But here, with you, I think I might be able to." Ethan nodded, his heart full. He had never expected this life, never imagined that he would find someone to share it with again. But now, with Ayanna by his side, it didn't feel like he was living in the past anymore. He was living in the present, in a future that was still unfolding, one day at a time. The days passed, and the seasons began to change. The land shifted, and the work on the ranch continued. But now, there was a sense of partnership, of shared purpose. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be times of hardship, moments of doubt, but they also knew they had something stronger than their pasts, each other. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ayanna spoke again, her voice filled with conviction. "I've been through so much," she said softly. But I think I'm finally ready to live again, or to let go of the past and build something new.
Maybe I'm not the same person I was before, but that doesn't mean I can't be whole again.
Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. I think you already are, he said simply. But in that moment, as they sat side by side, the future seemed brighter, not because it was free of pain, but because they had found a way to move forward together. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. The sun sank lower in the sky, the fire crackled beside them, and for the first time in a long time, both Ethan and Ayanna felt a sense of peace, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.